Why don't we begin? I'm Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard, and I'm a director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, which is hosting this event. We're following a very fine discussion with Michelle Dunn and Ruel Garect, which is Bob Kagan, the moderator of that discussion, said we would hopefully not be too much of a decline from. So this is a high standard for Aaron and Elliott to aim for. Aaron David Miller is a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars here in D.C. He served in the State Department, working primarily, I think, on the Middle East for about 3 decades with great distinction. I won't go through all of his positions. Elliott Abrams, I think, joined the State Department 2 or 3 years after Aaron. I think you came in '78. Elliott became Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization, then Human Rights in 1981. Has worked mostly, I guess, on the Middle East, or Middle East was included in his portfolios in both the Reagan administration and the recent George W. Bush administration, where he had a senior position at the National Security Council. So one aspect of this panel that I think, in addition to being extremely astute observers of events and commentators on events in the region, they both held senior positions of real responsibility quite recently in dealing with that region, and I'm going to push them in this panel to sort of speak as if they were to tell us what actual advice they would give policymakers in addition to their broader sort of thoughts about where we stand and what's happening in the region. So let's begin with Aaron and then Elliott, and then we'll have a discussion.
Elliott, it's really good seeing you again. Bill, thanks. Policy is usually an effort to try to find the right balance between doing too much on one hand and not enough on the other. It's usually a choice between imperfect and very bad options, particularly in the face of what we would all agree is now transformative change. Now, the Americans have done much better in responding to the Arab Spring, and we've been much less adept in responding to what I would call the Arab winter. And the dividing line with respect to our policy, in my judgment, having worked for Republican and Democratic administrations, is not left, right, conservative, liberal. It's success, failure, dumb or smart. That's the dividing line. Ideas should be borrowed willfully from any political quarter and ideology that offers up smart, sensible, and effective advice for the United States, because we are really in a very deep hole. For the past 16 years, and I speak in a bipartisan spirit, 8 under Bill Clinton, 8 under George W. Bush, in my judgment, we have failed to effectively have a strategy to project our power in either war-making or peacemaking. And we are now involved in 2 wars, the standard of which is not can we win, but when can we leave? And for a great power, that is not a good place to be. That sets the context, it seems to me, for the current frame of reference that we're being asked to respond to. Our street cred, in a region that values street credibility and power and success, which, by the way, is the world's most compelling ideology. Not nationalism, not communism, not capitalism, and not even, with respect to Michelle Dunn and Bob Kagan, democracy. Success is the world's most compelling ideology because success generates power and success generates constituents. Failure, on the other hand, generates the opposite. Niebuhr here is instructive. We should be very wary, in my judgment, of our own dreams of managing history. And it's with that in mind that I just want to offer 3 or 4 brief observations. I just told Bill, where you stand in life has a lot to do with where you sit. If I was in government still, I guarantee you I would have written 15 memos already. We would be the Energizer bunnies of American foreign policy. But with failure, and we've experienced quite a lot, comes a certain measure of wisdom and clarity. So I am annoyingly negative, I'll warn you in advance, and very cautious about what we encounter now, both with respect to the Arab Spring, where we've done better, and the Arab winter, Bahrain, Yemen, and Libya, where our policy choices are much more complex. Number 1, this is not our story, and nobody should delude themselves into believing that it is. That's good, because these, I won't call them revolutions, these popular uprisings are, in fact, authentic, legitimate, indigenous creations without external reference points to America, Israel, the EU, the Russians, or even perhaps a history of colonialism and imperialism. In 2 months, the Arabs, in tearing down their own Berlin Wall, so to speak, have accomplished more in terms of to advance the freedom agenda than we have accomplished. And again, this is bipartisan, in a dozen years. In a dozen years. And if Larry Summers was right about this, and he was, that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car because people care only about what they own. There's a degree of ownership here that rings true. And it may well be this ownership will have history's long arc smiling favorably on the forces of pluralism, democratization, over the longer term. The short term is another matter, which brings me to my second point. It's going to be messy because no great power, particularly one that is distant as we are, and who doesn't understand the region, in my judgment, to begin with. After all, we're surrounded by non-predatory neighbors to our north and south and fish to our east and west. We don't understand what it's like to grapple with the existential realities of what small powers deal with when they live on the knife's edge. We've forgotten all about that. And therefore, we come to this problem with a fix-it, pragmatic, naive, and idealized conception of what America can do. And the criteria now for this being a not bumpy ride, frankly, aren't there. However positive I may be about the future, the short term is going to be tough. The criteria for these smooth transitions, economic development, there's not enough of it. Broad concentration of wealth in these countries, there's not enough of it. State coherence, in some cases like Egypt, you have it. In Yemen and Libya, you don't. Sectarian divisions, there are too many. Places like Bahrain. And historical experience in dealing with democracies, not enough of it. So it's going to be bumpy. And we are confronted with many different types of change to which we are compelled, it seems to me, to come up with a coherent and effective policy. The president will give a speech at some point to turn what is now, I call, the whack-a-mole strategy in responding in an ad hoc fashion. And I don't fault him for this. How could anybody who's ever sat in a position of responsibility, faced with what exactly we have been confronted with since January, devise some overarching plan to deal with this? He will give a speech in an effort to bring rationality and coherence to it. Third, we are caught in contradictions of our own. We cut the devil's bargain with all of these regimes many years ago. Very simple bargain. In response for supporting our policies on war and peacemaking, we'll give you a pass. Not always, but by and large a pass on governance and human rights issues. Yeah, we have a State Department human rights report. It documents torture, arbitrary arrest. During the Bush administration, to their credit, the issue of freedom and democratization was put front and center on an agenda. But even there, it took a backseat to the prosecution of wars, and 3 wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the war against terror. And certain decisions were made not to push this agenda as aggressively. We still have that devil's bargain in Bahrain, in Yemen, and to a degree in Egypt, where our values are in conflict now, even now, with our interests. And that conflict produces dysfunctional policies. That's the problem we have, and that's not going away. Values out of whack with interests, out of whack with policies. So it's tough to find a unified message to respond to all of these changes. Fourth, I don't think our policies are going to change. I'm just reporting here. I don't want to engage in a moral argument about whether they should change or not. In my judgment, they're not going to change. The 4 policies that we pursued will, however, get less support, either from aggrieved dictators who hang on or from systems that open up, like in Egypt. Counterterrorism, less support. Containment of Iran, less support. Mubarak was sitting next to Sadat on October 6th when Islambuli tried to kill them both. The Iranians went ahead and named an avenue, a street in Tehran. Mubarak took this personally. Will Amr Moussa take it personally? Will al-Baradei take it personally? Gaza. Huge disconnects waiting to happen between American conception, the Arab-Israeli peace process. We don't even have to go into that. It's very difficult under the best of circumstances, or Hamas. So our space to operate, even in the best of circumstances, in my judgment, is going to contract. Let me just close with one comment on Libya. And I admit I'm not comfortable with this, because the gap between our rhetoric, Gaddafi is slaughtering his people, and the president's, he has to go, is at odds with what it is we've done. And our credibility essentially is being devoured and eroded in the process. There's no question about that. No question whatsoever. And I'm not happy about it. I'm not comfortable with it. It worries me. There's perhaps a humanitarian disaster looming in the not too distant future, a few weeks from now perhaps, to which we may not be able to respond. All of this has to be weighed, however, against another reality. Not whether or not the Arabs will like our intervention, but whether or not we can succeed. That's the only thing that counts. And whether or not we can succeed at an acceptable, appropriate cost. If the President of the United States believes that ousting Gaddafi is a vital national interest of the United States of America, then he ought to craft a strategy designed to accomplish that objective and to see it through in real time. Not adopt half measures like a no-fly zone or arming an opposition we know very little about. But the whole thing. And the fact that it hasn't happened speaks volumes about many things. Final comment. There are two transgressions that great powers always have to worry about committing. One is the transgression of omniscience, that we think we know everything. And the other is the transgression of omnipotence, the fact that we think we can do everything. And this is a cautionary tale. Without Iraq and Afghanistan, it might be less cautionary. But it is a cautionary tale.
Thanks, Aaron. Elliott?
Thanks, Bill and Aaron. Well, I'm happy to be here and happy to say that I disagree with most of what Aaron said. This will make it more interesting, because I think there is another sin that great powers can commit, and it's abdication, and it is the sin that's being committed now. I think that most of the problems that we have in the Middle East today are not because the gods are not smiling on us. It's because bad policies have been pursued and are being pursued. Arabs and Israelis have been negotiating more or less all the time for 20 years, but not in the last two. And it's not because the Arabs and the Israelis have changed their spots. It's because we have pursued a stupid policy that makes our obsession with a construction freeze in settlements and in Jerusalem the obstacle to their coming to the negotiating table. And it has been frankly acknowledged by the Palestinian president that, what's he supposed to do if we make that the obstacle? He's not going to overrule the president on that one. So there they are, stuck. The president came in essentially junking the freedom agenda. It's ironic that he did so, and just around the corner came these Arab revolts. Now you can say, who saw that coming? I think that's a fair question. Who saw Tunisia the day that it happened? But some people saw the fundamental problem. You may recall the beginning of the discussion, in a way, was the 2002 Arab Human Development Report put out by UNDP that talked about the democracy deficit and started a debate that was then picked up in 2002 and 3 and 4 and 5 by President Bush, who basically said, this kind of repression is not a formula for stability, not in the long run. Now, that was right, as it turns out, and the administration junked that policy of support for democracy in the Arab world for reasons that are no doubt complicated. But one need only think back to 2009 when we began to hear, and 10, from, for example, Egyptian opposition figures, civic leaders who were complaining about their abandonment by the United States. We're pursuing a policy we pursued, let us say, a policy of outreach, the open hand to Syria and Iran, and we have received nothing in return from either of those countries. Iran is an even more repressive place than it was a couple of years ago. And this bad policy led the United States into near silence after the stealing of the June 2009 elections and then an eruption from the Iranian people. And we treated that eruption as if it were an annoyance on the road to a nuclear deal. Now, why is this? Why is it that we haven't been able to have greater influence? And why is it that we haven't been able to sort of project power more? I guess my answer to that is, you have to want influence. You have to want to project power. You have to believe that the world is a better place if the United States has greater influence and is more powerful. You have to believe in American leadership. You cannot go around saying what the Secretary of State said a week ago, which is, we don't want to lead in the case of Libya. No, no, no. American leadership, we're against it. That's what I call abandonment and abdication. Now, Aaron said the president, and I'm sure this is right, that at some point within the next, month or two, the president will give a speech to bring rationality and coherence to all of this. And it will fail. The reason it will fail is that speeches don't solve problems. The president has a deep belief in the power of speech. And as well he might, because that power got him the presidency. It's no surprise. But the speeches aren't working. I take the Saudi invasion, if you will, police action, what are we going to call it, in Bahrain to be, at least in part, a Saudi statement that they don't think their security is being guaranteed by the United States anymore. They kind of think they're on their own as they look at Iran. And we'll talk about that later. I don't defend that action at all. But it is certainly less surprising than it would have been a couple of years ago. I think the problems that we face now are very, very difficult. I completely agree with Aaron as he described some of them. There are no easy answers. The notion that, the path to democracy is smooth, I think we'll find maybe we'll luck out one place, but mostly we won't, and the people of those countries will have a very hard time, though I think many will get to democracy. So the problems are very difficult, but Libya is a good example. The problem of what to do in Libya today is a very hard problem. It was an easier problem on Monday. It was a far easier problem on Friday. Now, as the Gaddafi troops approach Benghazi, the degree of intervention that the United States and France and England would need is, of course, higher. It's astonishing to me that there was, think back a week ago, maybe 9 days ago, I would argue that the declaration of a no-fly zone would have grounded the Libyan Air Force. And if it didn't, then shooting down one plane would have been the end of it, because what would be the point if you were Gaddafi then just losing your Air Force over the next day or two? And we didn't do it. Now it's a very great deal harder. There to me is a very good example, and I'll stop with this, of a problem that is now very hard, but was made much harder by the abdication of responsibility and influence on the part of an American government that seems to think the world will be a better place if and when and to the degree we abdicate.
Do you want to respond, Aaron, or should we go right to some more particulars? The disagreement's sort of obvious, so that's
right.
fine. Well, it seems to me, I'll state a proposition and then ask you both specific questions. Elliott's very unhappy about the last 2 years. Aaron's more unhappy about the last dozen or maybe even 20 years. But we are.
Since he joined the State Department.
We are
31 back.
Since you joined the State Department, right?
The first 3 were good, right?
But we are where we are, as they like to say. So let's sort of. I think the Arab Spring, Arab Winter formulation is helpful, and I think the previous panel focused very interestingly more on the Arab Spring side. I would say on Tunisia and Egypt. So maybe we should begin with the Arab Winter, plus it seems to be the more immediate crises we're facing. Libya, let's just take another minute on that, and then we can move, since it's so much in the headlines. What do we think is going to happen in Libya? Do you think?
You're going to end up with Gaddafi reimposing his control, most likely over the entire country, or a Libya and a half, with pockets of resistance, because he simply cannot reimpose his control. Or tactically, the opposition, such as it is, manages to carve out certain areas. In that kind of strategy, in that kind of situation, we would go to a longer-term containment policy, which we've already begun. Now, again, I am not here.
We're not going to say you're advocating this.
I'm not
this
here to
is-
defend the administration's policy or to basically put myself at odds fundamentally with a policy response with Elliott. The truth is, I am very uncomfortable about this. The risks of getting involved in a strategy that doesn't work because we haven't thought it through, however, need to be very carefully considered. I do not want responsibility. I pay taxes. I do not want responsibility for owning or controlling another Arab Muslim country. I do not. I mean, when we can talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, but I think we shouldn't. It does provide a certain set of a context for a much more cautionary response on the part of the administration, which I think explains it. Leadership, in my judgment, is not, do you want it badly enough? That leads you into the realm of possibility. Governments don't make policies solely on possibility. They make policies on reconciling possibility with probability. That is where success in our policy comes when it has come. And when we've led over the last 60 years, and I think there have only been 3 or 4, I describe them as moments, 45 to 50, sometime in the early 70s with détente and outreach to China, in the late 80s with Reagan and acceleration of the demise of the former Soviet Union, and I might add, editorial comment, in the last effective policy we did have 16 years ago, not terribly imaginative and creative, Bush 41 and James Baker, where we understood the balance between possibility and probability, and we projected our power effectively. I'm sorry.
That's okay. But, I mean, so whether that's correct,
Right.
true,
So-
and I agree incidentally that Iraq, I think we would all agree, Iraq
So
and
ma-
Afghanistan are very much in the
Bottom line-
president's mind.
Bottom line, make a judgment, Mr. President. Is the removal of Muammar Gaddafi a vital national
Well,
interest?
Tom
Is it or
Donilon
isn't
says
it?
in today's
All right,
paper
well,
that it's not. So.
Then all the rest
And how
is-
bad do you think, this is just analytical again, not blaming or whatever, how bad are the effects elsewhere, the demonstration effects or the practical effects of Gaddafi having the President of the United States having said you must go and him being apparently on the ropes, how much damage does it do in Egypt and Tunisia and throughout the region?
It sends a profoundly depressing and demoralizing signal to dictators and Democrats alike. Of that, an honest man or woman
Right.
cannot escape from
But
that.
not decisive, you think, or hope?
But not the balance, in my judgment, is not sufficiently weighted to prevent that signal from being sent, given what we would have to do
Right.
in order to take care of
But
this
you think it doesn't
particular business.
doom a reasonable
No.
outcome in Egypt?
It
It doesn't
doesn't-
doom
no.
other efforts to deal with, it doesn't encourage dictators, or it doesn't give dictators a blank check to do whatever they want. I mean, it's a limitable,
Well, you're
it's a
seeing-
limitable bad outcome is what you would hope, I
It's a
suppose.
bad outcome. It's not as bad as as a untested, untried, unknown set of policies designed to unseat Gaddafi, which we are going to have to lead.
I guess I disagree, at least in part. First, what's really unique here is the European and Arab leadership. I mean, it's an astonishing Arab League vote. We worked for years and years in the OAS to get it from being a dictator's club. We worked for years, even decades, to overcome the idea that no country has the right to pronounce, much less intervene, on the domestic setup in another, and to substitute for it the idea that democracy is to be expected in every country in the Americas. And here's the Arab League, my God, the Arab League saying, please intervene in Libya. And of course the British and the French leading the way, and I do think that were we to have undertaken a no-fly zone, or indeed if we undertake one tomorrow, they'll participate, and they do have air forces that can be of considerable use, because we're talking about a place, after all, that's very close to Europe, and you could use air bases in Italy. But where I disagree, I think, is more deeply is I think that there is no computer that could do the assessment that you're asking for of, you know, what's possible, because ideology plays a role. Ronald Reagan did different things than Jimmy Carter had done, partly because he had a different assessment of the Soviet Union on a kind of military basis, economic basis, but it's a belief system. It's an ideology. And I think that each administration has one, whether they know it or not. I mean, even those who believe in the, let's say, realpolitik like Brent Scowcroft, it's an ideology too. It may be an ideology of avoiding ideology. The president has an ideology, I think. He came to office with the view that there's too much of this American projection of power, and we're going to put a stop to it. And one of the reasons we're going to put a stop to it is people hate it. But I would argue that in the case of Libya and more generally, it's not so clear that people hate it. In the case of Libya, people are asking for it. Arabs are asking for it. And I've been struck, I'm sure we've all been struck by the fact that, you know, in Tahrir Square and elsewhere, nobody's burning American flags. So I think I think the administration exaggerated this idea that, you know, we're hated everywhere because of the war in Iraq. So that's where I would disagree. I think the administration no administration does a mechanical view of what's possible. Every administration has an ideology that tells them what's valuable, and therefore you do a different cost-benefit analysis.
I think, though, Elliott, you're doing the previous administration a disservice, because the truth is the previous administration set parameters within which this administration has functioned. It is added to those parameters an unwillingness, well, some things that I don't like, rhetoric that far exceeds reality in our capacity to act, which is consistent from the Arab-Israeli peace process to Libya, even to the Arab Spring. There's no question that and you know, George Shultz used to say, when we have no effective policy, pressure grows to give a speech. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen now. But on Afghanistan, on the war against terror, this administration has in fact protected itself politically to a large extent, because it has become, as a consequence of the policy parameters laid down by the previous administration, partially indebted, or the inheritors of George W. Bush's policy. And I think it chose to, having doubled down on Afghanistan, having not closed Guantanamo, having prosecuted through Predator drones very aggressively this war against terror, call it what it is, it has drawn a line against other enterprises and ventures that seem, I won't say reckless, that seem beyond that are unknown. How's that? That are unknown. I talked about omniscience and omnipotence. We don't know. We think we know, but we don't know. I don't know anything about the Arabs and the Israelis. I know a lot more about us. And I think that's where the introspection, it's the look in the mirror that's so critical. And I think the president has looked in the mirror and he's made a cruel, unforgiving, hard calculation that in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan, the historical legacy, the limitations of American power, the economy, that this one is beyond, maybe not even our capacity, beyond his desire and will to achieve. Now, we can beat him up all day long for that calculation.
This one being Libya, or
this
more?
one being, yes, because this is the most cruel manifestation of the Arab Spring. Bahrain and Yemen are much more complex in some ways, because we are allied with Saleh and King Hamad. We are not with Gaddafi. And on this one, this shows, it seems to me, the strengths, primarily the weaknesses of a power that has proclaimed without the capacity or willingness to act.
I think it's analytically an interesting point, and you may well be right. Some of us who had been, of course, skeptics of the Obama administration, but then were pleased actually by the movement over towards sustaining more or less Bush policies on the war on terror, and especially the surge in Afghanistan, which, and then the reasonable success, incidentally, I would argue, of both of those policies, and the somewhat maintenance of the effort in Iraq, let's say, or the non-hasty withdrawal from Iraq. pleased by the reasonable success of those policies, therefore perhaps mistakenly assumed that this president might rethink other, again, without being judgmental, let's just say, pretty deeply held views on his part, apparently, as to the limits of American power in the region. But I think you may be right that in a certain way he exhausted his willingness to exercise power with those efforts and is almost more reluctant to get involved in yet, and you do hear this, of course, from people in the administration, yet another war, two is enough kind of thing. And there's a funny way in which perhaps the effort in Afghanistan, rather than emboldening him, has sort of made him think that I'm doing enough and I can't do anything more. And that's an interesting question that historians will investigate, I suppose, at some point.
I would just add here, I think one has to mention the military. I think we know what advice Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen have given the president with respect to Libya, and he's following their advice. Max Boot, my colleague at CFR, put it, I thought, pretty well in the Wall Street Journal today, that people describe a no-fly zone over Libya as if it were D-Day. That's what we've been getting from Gates and Mullen, and I want to say, first of all, I object to that deeply. I think they have a moral and legal obligation to give that advice to the president in his office, not to give it to the press, and thereby circumscribe a president's choices. So I really think that's a terrible thing that they did, and that no defense secretary or chairman of the JCS should ever do. But I'm struck also by they gave the same advice, if you will, to Bush, and there would have been no surge had he followed that advice. He had to go outside, and the president, for whatever reason, is not going outside. I leave it there.
I just want, since you're both so fatalistic about Libya, I would like to say editorially that I still can't quite bring myself to believe that the president of the United States, having said that he must go, is going to sit there and allow him to roll up the entire country. I agree that you might end up with the best we could do now is perhaps stop him short of Benghazi and have some kind of, sort of safe haven for the insurgents. That would look a little bit more like the Balkans, actually, in various stages before President Clinton really intervened in '95. But I could be wrong. That's just a question, partly of practicality
this
and partly
is what I'm hearing from people in the administration. That is, President, you're too quick with the criticism. The president means what he said, and you will see as this develops. He isn't going to let it just go down the tubes that way.
I mean, that may be right. I've heard the term used, hurting stalemate, by which the United States and its allies become much more active, much more committed on the military side, and create a balance of power within the country that allows the opposition essentially to confront the colonel with two choices. Either a negotiated settlement which forces his withdrawal and removal from the country, or ultimately, with sanctions, an oil embargo, and a variety of means of support, to truly tighten the noose.
I guess we'll see. Let me ask you both, so let's run around the region here quickly, a little more quickly. This has been a very useful, I think, discussion. Bahrain, I mean, should one be, how alarmed or unhappy should one be about what's happened and is now happening there, and what are the consequences or implications? Elliott, or Aaron?
Well, one should be very unhappy that we have reached this point at which there was no deal, there was no compromise between the royal family and the Shia population. I thought there would be a deal. I thought there was a deal out there. I am not sure because I don't see the intel and the embassy reporting. To what extent hardliners in the royal family prevented this agreement, and to what extent did hardliners in the Shia community prevent it? I have talked to people from Bahrain about what a disaster I thought this was, and the answer that you get back from government people is the situation could not be permitted to slide into anarchy and chaos, and who knows what would have come after that, and the implication being Iran. And we had to freeze it, and now it's frozen, and there can be a negotiation. And I've heard this from some of the GCC people as well. First we had to freeze it, now there'll be a negotiation. If I believed that, then I would say, well, this is a terrible thing that we got to this point, but okay, now negotiate. And negotiate means the royal family needs to make real concessions and real reforms and really give up a substantial amount of power and move toward a constitutional monarchy. But I don't think the royal family is ready for that, and I certainly don't think the Saudis are ready for it. I guess if I were asked a policy question, I would say, let's have lots of conversations with the Emiratis now and see if we can persuade them, or maybe they already believe that actually these reforms are necessary, and maybe they can, to a certain degree, countervail the Saudis and push the royal family quietly toward some kind of deal. I still think there's a deal there. Even if there were, the royal family is the link between a Shia majority population and the GCC and all the aid coming from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and the Arab League. So it ought to be, it's a very American thing to say, these guys ought to be able to work out a compromise. But if the royal family does not wish to make that compromise, then I think that it won't be more than a year or two before you can meet with the king in Geneva, where he'll be living in exile.
Is that right?
I think the distinction between presidencies and monarchies, the presidencies have been less, or the republics have been, quote unquote, less resilient. The monarchies more so, only works up to a point. Time, Elliott's right, time is the ultimate arbiter of anything that's worthwhile in terms of success or failure. It just may be a longer movie. I think the problem with Bahrain is that you have conflicts within conflicts. You do have this conflict within the ruling family. You have divisions between Shia leaders, and you have arguably three external players, which complicate matters. We're the least complicating factor in this one. The Saudis, who are really angry at us. And this just shows that the bargain, oil for security or whatever else it was, had broken down years ago. They're in it on their own, and they're the latest power to say no to us without cost or consequence, which they will continue to do as they attend to their own interests. And the Iranians, who, while they didn't stir the pot, or at least didn't make it boil, they will look for ways to stir it. So this is a complicated piece of the Arab winter, and it really would take remarkable leadership in order to create some common ground for a quick resolution.
Half the people I know in Washington, these are most people not in government, so when you say the Saudis are mad at us and have sort of cast themselves free, have a sort of goodbye and good riddance attitude. That's my personal attitude, frankly. And but most serious people in government, of course, having spent 60 years cultivating that relationship, and everyone who was in government having been, rewarded for having cultivated that relationship, I might say, has the opposite attitude. What about Saudi Arabia? Let's talk about transitions that could be seen to be coming. You on the Egypt Working Group saw that an 82-year-old guy who'd rigged elections for 30 years at some point he was either going to try to rig one too many or try to hand off power to one son too many or die. And here in Saudi Arabia, we have do we have a somewhat comparable circumstance? Is the House of Saud going to be in charge of Saudi Arabia just the way it has been for decades, 5 or 10 years from now, or is that something that's going to pop at some moment?
I think the first thing is the cushioning effect of money is significant. The king was able to come home from his recuperation and spend a gigantic amount of money, $35 billion, $37 billion, I think, and that'll have an impact on a certain number of people in the population. It's one of the reasons why one could be more optimistic about a post-Gaddafi Libya. There's just so much money with which to build up the country as opposed to Egypt. So that's first. Secondly, there is a large constituency for conservatism and non-democratic conservatism in Saudi Arabia. But I'm struck by the possibility of a real succession crisis. The king is about 90, give or take. It's not clear how good his health is. The Crown Prince's health is very poor. It's not clear who comes next. There may be fighting over that. There may be fighting over who comes after him, if the next one is Prince Nayef. That period of succession, reminiscent of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, means that government is not as capable, as effective as it might be. And you have this time bomb of a large young male population that is underemployed or unemployed and untrained for anything. So these are not people who are going to go off to work in merchant banks in London. So there is a certain amount of dynamite lying around there.
Aaron, Saudi Arabia?
People spend their entire lives studying this subject. I think short-term trends, combination of what Elliott identified, cradle to grave, womb to tomb benefits, combined with a different kind of political contract between the king and his subjects, combined with deals that the ruling family has cut in terms of religious legitimacy, will probably mean that the Saudis will survive this round of the transformation. But I don't know who it was. I mean, it could have been the manager of the Devil Rays, the Rays now. Asked after they won the World Series, what his reaction was, and he said, these kids have been used to losing, but now they've won, and their mind is now stretched to incorporate within their own personal experience a different kind of outcome. That's, in the Arab world now, that's gone. The fear factor is gone. And the notion of personal responsibility and identity and actually assuming responsibility rather than blaming the Americans or very often is the case, the Israelis, I think this augurs well, again, in the long arc, but poorly for regimes like the Saudis.
Do you both agree on that? I mean, we shouldn't just pass over that. I mean, the status quo ante is not coming back. This is a huge moment, and we are now in a new world. You both, I mean, agree, not just speaking cliches here, but I mean, you know what I mean by this. This is that we are really...
I agree with what Aaron said about that. On Saudi Arabia, one of the things you've got here is a very old king. He's been in power essentially as crown prince and king for 15 years, who's widely admired in the kingdom because he is honest and he is pious. Whoever follows him will not have that reputation, will not have that admiration on the part of the people, and it comes at or will come at a time when, as Aaron said, people's minds are expanded. So it's another reason to think that succession in Saudi Arabia will raise all sorts of issues like, how come he gets to be an absolute monarch? Tell me that again. So I think, yes, there's no turning back. This is not a blip.
I mean, one just cautionary note, it was Twain who argued that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And the rhythmic patterns of revolutionary events and popular uprisings are worth paying attention to. Are these truly revolutionary? Do you really see the turning of the old order? Is it France in 1789, Russia in 1917, Tehran in 1979, even the former Soviet Union in 1989? I don't know the answer, but my inclination is that we are in a transformational phase which will give rise to what I call a transactional phase, in which bargaining, negotiating within the institutions of established states, with the possible exception of Libya, which may undergo a de novo creation. I mean, if Gaddafi is forced from power, will take over. So you may end up with, before we throw everything away, you may end up with, well, more than a few remnants of the old.
I think that's exactly right. In the case of Ben Ali and in the case of Gaddafi, there are no institutions. So once you get rid of the guy and his rotten family, you are starting de novo. It's not true in Egypt, for example, with lots of institutions, including, first of all, the army. That's more typical of the region and most countries in the region. And even, and look at the American Revolution. I mean, George Washington did not come out of nowhere. He came out of the aristocracy. And so did a lot of the other people who ran the country after it became a country. So, I mean, you can have a revolution without having the French Revolution.
Yes, Neil Ferguson actually had a rather good, didn't like his piece 3 or 4 weeks ago where he was mocking, in a sense, the possibility of liberal democracy in Egypt, but on the other hand, he did have a point. I guess an Obama advisor was quoted as saying all good revolutions are organic revolutions. Right. And Neil pointed out that actually and citing the American Revolution, where, of course, there famously were French troops, I believe, on our side, rather famous Frenchmen after whom, who have statues here in Washington and after whom avenues were named. There were actually foreign troops on the other side, very famous episodes of crossing the Delaware on Christmas Day. So there's a certain kind of rewriting. Everyone appeals to history every which way, I think, in this circumstance. If you both agree that there's a whether it was inevitable in a sense or not, or a failure of this administration or not, that there's a diminution of respect for American power or fear of American power, or in any case, sense that they have to sort of follow an American playbook in the region. What does that say about Iran in two respects? I mean, one, what I'd be curious on your views of what's likely to happen with respect within Iran or with respect to Iran in the next year or two, and to the degree that the backup to Iran not getting nuclear weapons was a kind of, among most foreign policy experts, a kind of U.S.-led containment regime of Iran in which we would prevent nuclear proliferation in the region by implicit or explicit guarantees and the like. Is that one casualty, perhaps, of what's happened over the last few months, or was that never going to happen anyway? But I'm just curious, both what you think about Iran itself and then about Iran and the region over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Arab and non-Arab states will assimilate, the ones that haven't been changed yet, will either draw one of two conclusions from what's happened. They'll either look in the mirror and decide we have to make some preemptive changes, or they'll be looking in the rearview mirror, which basically what they're going to hear are footsteps coming for you. The Iranians, I think, will look in the rearview mirror. The malacracy is not going to take any sort of cautionary tale away from these changes. They may worry about it, that it happened with such suddenness, and it was so organic without external intervention, but they see in it enormous amounts of opportunities because they probably know the Arabs better than we do. They know these state structures. They know the limitations, the grievances. They know us to a certain extent. So I think on balance, they may profit from this. On the issue of the nuclear, I mean, I think our containment policy may well be dealt a blow by this, because I think the focus, we're distracted, we're not focused. Other regimes, particularly the Egyptians, may look at containment in a very difficult, a different way than we did before. It's Mubarak sitting next to Sadat when Islambuli tried to kill them both, and the Iranians naming a street in Tehran after Islambuli. And Mubarak, who probably believes the Iranians tried to kill him in '95, being personally invested in this. Now, is al-Baradei going to be as invested? Is Amr Moussa going to be as invested? Doesn't mean the Egyptian military's fear of Iran will diminish. It won't. But you're into a new phase where there's going to be a much greater resonance of these kinds of ideas. And that will not be good for our containment policy.
I agree with most of that, and I thought, well, first, I agree with Ruel also, though, in the point he made, that is that in the medium run, let's say, this is very bad for Iran because they're selling a product that no one in the Middle East wants. They're selling stolen elections, they're selling censored internet and TV, they're selling mullahs who tell you how to behave, they're selling secret police. No one wants that. So I think in the medium run, it does make it harder for them. If they turn out to be, of course, it depends how things turn out, but if they turn out to be surrounded by a lot of Arab democracies, fledgling democracies, democracies trying to come into being, I think that makes it, much harder for them. Now, with respect to the containment, I think Aaron's right there too. We have a policy that now says, okay, we're going to sanction Iran and force them to make a deal. But oil prices are not cooperating. I haven't done the calculation. What is the increment to Iran, let's say over 2010 and 11, from the rise in oil prices to what was at one point 105? Now it's gone down a bit, but it's clearly in the billions and billions, probably tens of billions of dollars. That makes the effect of the sanctions much weaker. Containment, after all, containment is a military strategy. Containment says, thus far and no further. Go through the Fulda Gap, World War III. Who believes that? I mean, who is going to watch an administration that thinks that a no-fly zone over Libya is too hard and think that administration is going to bomb nuclear sites in Iran? So I think that though we can say in those great speeches, all options are on the table, and maybe they are on the table. I mean, this is the problem. that analysis doesn't mean that the president wouldn't use force. It just means that nobody believes he will. So I think it means the containment policy, I hate to say this, but it seems to me it's pretty much gone.
Let me ask one last question. Then I have time to take a few questions from all of you. What haven't we discussed that if you all were having this discussion in the Roosevelt room or in front of the president and his team, top advisors, if he said, okay, what other things should I be worrying about apart from the stuff we've discussed, which is basically North Africa. We'll stipulate in this previous panel, in this one, we've covered sort of Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, the Gulf, and Iran. Is everything else sort of, what else would you say to Mr. President? Don't forget about this over the next 3 to 6 months. This could be something you'll have to deal with.
That you'll have to deal with?
Well, you may wish to,
I
or you'll
don't
be
see-
pressured to
I mean,
deal
there's-
with.
I have this vision now of this one other issue that's floating out.
Well,
there, which is-
you can pick 2 or 0.
which is always mentioned as the key to protecting American interests in the region.
It could be a disaster
That
for
would-
American
that would be
interests.
Right, that would be that. I mean, look, I worry about only 2 things. Somebody detonating a unconventional weapon in Times Square and the Saudis basically collapsing. That's what I worry about. I mean, Japan is a separate concern which has emerged. Right. But that's what I worry about. Because that could either of those things could fundamentally alter the way we look at things here. And I mean, my view of this world, of this region, even with the Arab Spring, is that it's very dysfunctional, it's broken. I'm not terribly hopeful. We're stuck in the middle of it. We can't extricate ourselves from it, and we can't fix it. So we have to pick our spots very carefully. We have to decide what really matters and what doesn't, and everything else has to be subordinated to that fact. And I mean,
So you wouldn't have high hopes for any other particular diplomatic initiative or economic initiative in the region?
What are we talking about? A new, I remember in the 90s, it was the Middle East Marshall Plan that was much in vogue. We were going to basically pretend this was post-World War II Europe between 45 and 50, and we were going to fundamentally remake economic institutions and stabilize the place. Well, that doesn't work.
Do you think that could work for Egypt? I mean,
yes,
I'd say Bob Ruel, I don't think you were here for the whole first panel, Bob Ruel and Michelle, I think we're reasonably optimistic that even with a very bad outcome in Libya, even with what they would regard as a pretty bad outcome in Bahrain, even with other bad things in the region, that with a reasonably attentive U.S. government, reasonably effective efforts to help the people who should be helped and to pressure the military to yield power, that we would have a pretty good outcome in Egypt. And I suppose one could make the case that that counts for a lot. It's a very big country, and that would be a very big deal.
It does, and we have a comparative advantage here in the issue of economic assistance. I mean, what Secretary announced was a large dose, and we can always, and we're good at this, launch an Operation Tin Cup. We've done it before on Egypt's behalf. That's comparative advantage number 1. And again, if the Arab-Israeli issue if there were a chance that the gaps between these 2 sides could be bridged, parens, very unlikely, close parens, that's another comparative advantage. Because that really would diffuse some of the pressures that will come from the anti-democratizers and support without linkage, would support those reformist efforts. And we know how to do this. It's just, it's not ready for prime time, to say the least.
I'm worried about the Egyptian economy, perhaps more worried than the first panel. Tunisia's 6.5 million people. Money goes a long way. Libya's rich. Bahrain, Oman, going to get Gulf money. Egypt, 80 million people. The tourist industry's dead. There's no foreign investment. Until things settle down, you can assume those will continue, so we'll have a terrible 2011. Tin Cup, well, in the past tin cups, we've relied substantially on Japan, which we cannot now do, and on the Gulf Arabs, who may not be willing to help in this case. Saudis are really, for mostly wrong reasons, are mad at us, and they're also going to want to attend to the Gulf. So the worry, of course, is that if the economic situation, what all of us remember from high school and college, that wonderful phrase, revolution of rising expectations. I don't think we can meet it in Egypt economically, and I wonder whether that leads to populism in economics and a kind of Gresham's law in politics too.
Concern. questions. We have about 15 minutes. Take quick questions, quick answers. Sir.
Thank you. Thanks for such an interesting discussion. Rich Eisendorf, independent writer and consultant. You're focusing a lot, of course, on American foreign policy, but with the Arab League taking a stance against Libya and calling for a no-fly zone, Saudi Arabia sending troops into Bahrain, what about Arab action, in addition to just statement, in Libya in response to the situation?
Any chance of the Arabs doing something without us, I guess is the question.
Realistically, what could they do? Help the opposition, particularly in Benghazi, certainly with humanitarian goods. They've already done that. The Emiratis, the Turks even have shipped in some planes of humanitarian goods, money, and guns. Maybe they're arming. It doesn't seem to be true, but they could, I would think, ship in arms via Egypt to Benghazi. I mean, theoretically, they could do more than that, but I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think the problem here is, there was a point at which Secretary Clinton said we were attempting to measure international support for doing something in Libya. And this is always the wrong verb. Secretary Albright, I remember going around in a similar situation, asking the Europeans, what do they think? That's wrong. The United States is a superpower. We should say, follow me. We're going to do something about Gaddafi. Are you with me? And then I think we might have had some of the Arabs joining this NATO effort.
I think it was, to be fair, it was Secretary Christopher. I mean, maybe Secretary Albright did this too, but the most famous such instance was Warren Christopher in '93, sent on an ill-fated trip by President Clinton to sort of see what the Europeans wanted us to do in the Balkans, and that predictably, I think, this would be your point, I guess, ended up with no one doing anything for 2 years, and eventually we did.
I'm happy to take that correction.
Yes, in case Madeleine Albright is here, or one of her. Sir.
Thank you. Ibrahim Hussein, I am an Egyptian American living here in Washington, D.C. Aaron, I hope you don't mind if I call you Aaron.
Go right ahead, we're very informal here.
Please. I'm really surprised when you said there is a contradiction between our values and our interest. I decided to come to this country and become an American citizen because of our values. And in the long run, our values serve our interest. The question is, are you looking at the short-term political expedience or the long-term value-based positions? So I don't agree with you that our values are not consistent with our interests.
Well,
I think they are.
We live in a democratic polity where there is some relationship between our foreign policy and domestic political support. Now, having spent the better part of almost a quarter of a century working for the Department of State, I don't know even where to start in cataloging the places in which our values and our interests have collided. And I don't know for a great power, Ibrahim, if in fact there ever is a confluence. Great powers behave hypocritically, they behave inconsistently because they can. So, in the 90s, we're trying to get an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. So what if Arafat has state security courts that are essentially acting in an authoritarian manner and abusing human rights? So what if we tolerate no transparency in the Palestinian financial and economic situation? We made these judgments repeatedly.
They were all wrong.
Well, all right. Well,
I'm serious.
Fine.
No, I'm being.
This goes on and on and on back to one of the two most effective secretaries of state in the last 60 years, where in the service of American interests, American values, that would be Henry Kissinger, often got subordinated to harder core, realpolitik concerns. It's not that we're a terrible country. It's not that we have bad values. It's just that when you operate abroad in this world, these are the choices that great powers face. And the truth is, the longer you the longer you dwell in the neighborhood, the more you start to resemble taking choices that are similar to those that the neighbors take. And I think this is very, very difficult. We won't talk to Hezbollah, rightly. And yet we've engaged in Afghanistan and in Iraq with groups and individuals who have probably been responsible for the deaths of many more Americans. And we do it because when we put American men and women in harm's way, whatever political or ideological constraints fall away. That becomes the dominant American interest. And it, in some respects, conflicts with our values.
Thanks, Aaron. Sir. Oh, ma'am, sorry. I didn't see the right hand. Yes.
I'm LaDan Arch, and I just have a quick question from Elliott, but sorry, you, Mr. Miller, you just wondered twice whether al-Baradei and Amr Moussa have any interest in this, and I just wanted to remind maybe everyone that al-Baradei got the second or third of the anti-Bush Nobel Prizes on the back of what he did on Iran, so he was extremely involved on Iran issues, and Amr Moussa, Iran was a thorn on his side has been for many, many years on the Palestinian-Iranian issue, Palestinian-Arab issue, where the Iranians kept, inserting themselves, whether directly or through Hezbollah and others. So they are, whether they want it or not, they are, and personally as an Iranian American, I can tell you, and having been in many Arab lands, that what Ruel said was correct. The way the Arabs feel about Iranians is the way it is. So. Anyway, and Elliott, I just wanted to ask, this came in the prior panel about the information that's given to policy people in the policy arena in the U.S. And having worked in different areas, I personally don't see the embassies being that giving that kind of information. But what do you think about how information is disseminated and intelligence, basically, from our different agencies? From the Central Intelligence Agency to DIA and others, how can that be improved? And after 9/11, there was information sharing, but then there was WikiLeaks. So what do you think?
That's a very hard question. I should just start by saying I remember when I left the State Department in January '89 with George Shultz, I said to Secretary Shultz, now, how am I going to know what's going on? I'm not going to have any, after 8 years, no access to intelligence. And Shultz replied, oh, that's completely nonsense. He said, the intel tells you who's the new foreign minister on Tuesday, then he's appointed Wednesday, so you read it in the New York Times Thursday. Big deal, so you find out Tuesday instead of... there's a lot of truth
And that
to
was
that.
before the internet. Now it's
That was-
now
yes.
it's about a
now it's
10-minute
instant,
lead time.
right. So the question, I guess, is how do you know what's going on in another country? How do you, sitting here in Washington in the State Department, Defense Department, NSC, how do you know what's going on in Egypt? You get intelligence reporting, you get embassy reporting, and then you get, ROTC, rest of the country? I mean, you get everything else. You get, and I do think there's a problem here with the reporting that is focused on governments, which is what most of the reporting is. The embassy's in the capital. Sometimes you may have a consulate that's in another city because it's the economic capital, but you're really hearing about the elites, and the embassy reporting is great on divisions within the elite because that's who you meet. Underlying trends are harder for people who stay in the capital to figure out. What do Egyptians really think? How would you know that? But of course, the same thing is true of the agency. The station is also in the capital city. How do you get out there? I mean, there are ways to try to figure it out. When I was doing Latin America stuff in the 80s, we had this old joke that was actually not a joke, and that was, talk to the guy who owns the Coca-Cola bottling company. He's got people all over the country. He knows what's going on. He has his finger on the pulse more than the CIA station chief probably does. Talk to the Peace Corps people who are all over the country. What are they hearing in all those villages? I think this is a big problem because I think there is a tendency on the part of those who report to Washington to report on specific things that they know about and have valuable knowledge about. But when you ask, the let's say the analyst who's doing this at the CIA, often that analyst is 2 years out of a MA program, has spent very little time in the country in question, and really doesn't know the country all that well. You're asking an extremely difficult question, and you're not going to get much of an answer. So what is remarkable to me is not that we didn't predict Tunisia, Egypt, Libya. What's remarkable is, in a certain sense, how profound was the insight that President Bush had 8 years ago when he said, this is not going to last, guys. This is not a formula for stability. Ultimately, there is no Arab exception. Arabs are not beyond the reach of liberty, and sooner or later this blows up. And frankly, that insight was one we were not getting from State Department and agency reporting back then.
You want to add anything, Aaron?
No.
I mean, I would just say, there's a little unfairness in my experience having been in government and then commenting on things outside. I'd make 2 quick points, because it's an interesting question. One is, of course, it's unreasonable to expect people to predict things. People who know the most don't predict things correctly. Mubarak didn't predict what would happen in Egypt correctly, and he presumably had access to an awful lot of real-time intelligence about what was going on there, and he had a certain vested interest, or at least his people did, and his son did, who was a more alert and active guy. His future kind of hung on what was going to happen. And I think it's especially true in revolutionary situations or in situations of rapid change. By definition, things are changing, and people who have spent 5, 10, 20 years studying the status quo, or when it becomes the status quo ante, don't have a terribly good view of what's going to happen, and no one does, because it's genuinely a fluid and uncertain situation. It's like, in an even basketball game with 2 minutes left, saying, well, who's going to win? Well, you don't know who's going to win, because it will depend on whether a shot is 2 inches off or not, and I think that's probably more the kind of situation we're in now than a static situation, where I do think having embassies get out of the capital and all that make more difference. In fact, it's somewhat a bit of a political science cliche, I think, that in these kinds of fast-moving situations, it's often the genuine experts who are most resistant to accepting that things are changing quickly. Because, in a way, it makes sense. You know the most. If you knew the most about the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, you were impressed that this thing had been there for 30 years. They had crushed Hungary. They had crushed Czechoslovakia, the Czech Spring. And you knew how this repressive apparatus worked, and you knew it had worked awfully well. They had crushed the Soviet Jewish sort of dissent in the 70s. It all seemed to be kind of stable. They were in a way the last to realize that suddenly it was different from the way it had been the 2, 3, 4 previous iterations. And I do think, to be fair, in this case, it was clear. I do think, on the other hand, you could also say, in some general level, surely the thing couldn't keep going the way it was. It does seem unnatural in the modern world, or in any world almost, that a bunch of dictators could just hang on to power in manifestly unsuccessful, to use Aaron's term, which I think is right. It's one thing if you're if you're the Chinese, you can make a case, I think, I hope it's not the case, and I myself would argue against it, but you can make a case that that regime has some prospects of longevity because they're producing results. But dictatorships that aren't producing results, presumably by definition, are going to be somewhat vulnerable. And when they're trying to hand off power to their kids is a time when they seem particularly vulnerable, just by successions. This is a cliche of political science. Successions are always the hardest thing to pull off in dictatorships or even in monarchies. An awful lot of Shakespeare plays and all this hinge on this. And sure enough, it's no accident that there was the succession. In Egypt, really what provoked it was, in a sense, a succession crisis. So you'd think people might have had a general sense that things might fall apart, though I think, and I'd be curious to know what you think about this, people got a little fooled, people like me and us, I think probably all of us have been saying this for 15 years, and this can't just, Assad can't just hand off power to his kid. There's no tradition of that, particularly in Syria. And the House of Saud can't just go on forever, and then Mubarak's going to do it. It's sort of ridiculous. And then it looked like it was happening successfully, actually. And I think a way people might have been lulled a little bit into an assumption of more stability than turned out to be the case. I don't know.
Just say one word, and I say a word in defense of Hosni Mubarak. I think, at the very end he seemed clueless, but actually, as I think back to the Bush years, he did act as if he were sitting on a powder keg.
Right.
It was very striking that we all had this view that sort of, when was the last time an Arab regime fell that we didn't push over with the U.S. Army? Never, it doesn't happen, it'll last forever. Mubarak, if there was a food riot in some town, he would flip out and immediately there would be gigantic subsidies in the price of bread. He treated it as if it were always on the edge. he never actually said, Gamal will follow me. We always felt this was something that was being pushed by Suzanne Mubarak, President Mubarak's wife. And Mubarak was sort of curiously diffident about it, maybe for the exact reasons that you suggest. Now, he may have had the worst of all possible worlds by doing so, but it's interesting that we thought Egypt was a hell of a stable place, and he didn't.
Makes you wonder about these other places. One last question. Yes, ma'am.
Just going back to your comments, Mr. Kristol, about the fluidity of the situation with revolutions and how the policymakers in Washington just can't predict. With those comments, can you think of maybe some more allowances from where President Obama is coming from, where in the early days of the Libyan uprising, the rebels were making massive inroads, and it appeared they could do it on their own, and the imposition of a no-fly zone might have incurred Libyan casualties, possibly turning the population against the United States. All these might not be for good. And then by the time it had turned against them, it had been evident that it became more apparent that a no-fly zone would not suffice to turn the tide against Gaddafi.
Maybe I'll say a word, and then you two should make your final remarks, which will be more insightful than mine. I mean, I take that point, and I've tried, as a commentator, since being in government, to remember what it was like to be in government and to make allowances. And so on Egypt, where I thought they were slow, the administration was slow in embracing what was happening and in getting on the right side of that historic change. And I think we heard an interesting discussion of that in the previous panel from Michelle and Ruel. I actually thought they did come around. All administrations are a little late. I was in the first Bush administration. History has treated them kindly, as it should, I think, for the management of the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Iron Curtain and the unification of Germany. But to be there in real time was to watch us being a little behind and adjusting. And gee, can we really put up with a united Germany? And then Kohl, said, well, that's going to happen. And then, to their credit, Jim Baker and others decided, well, if it's going to happen, let's accept it and let's make sure it's a united Germany within the West and within NATO, not a united neutralist Germany. And then the fact that they were a week late on sort of accepting that it was going to be united Germany is something that one slides over. And so on Egypt, I defended the administration for precisely kind of the reasons you suggested. They were a little slow, but they ended up in the right place. And I thought no harm or not much harm done. I'm a little taken aback to hear Ruel's story to see what happened yesterday. The Egyptian opposition isn't quite as charitable as I am, I think. But they'll, so they did refuse to meet with Secretary Clinton. That was pretty striking. But nonetheless, I take it, if we move ahead and work with them, they will. That's not a lasting wound. I think on Libya, we did this first letter that I signed. I think Elliott signed the Foreign Policy Initiative letter urging the president to be strong, 2 weeks ago, I suspect. Mm-hmm. And we knew we were ahead of the administration. That's the way administrations work. They're a little hesitant to take risks, as they should be. Maybe it's our job to say, hey, there's a risk of not acting too, and please act. But not to pivot at some point when it was clear that he wasn't going to topple by himself. And when there was about 4, 5, 6 days where I think our intervention could really have made a difference before he really regained momentum and was able to now have a lot of momentum, I think that was a very badly missed opportunity, and I don't really agree that it was that difficult or risky. Acting has its risks, not acting has its risks. To govern is to choose, and in this case, I just think the price we've paid for inaction and continued inaction, combined with his statement. If he had made this hard-headed calculation, if Aaron had been there and had persuaded him 2 weeks ago, this is awfully difficult. It's not fundamentally a core interest. It's a tough thing to watch. These people get killed, and a revolution that seems to have decent aspirations fail. But you're not going to be willing to pull the trigger on this, Mr. President. So stay out of it. Wish them well. Do not say that Gaddafi must go. Once the President of the United States says that, in my view, you are committed to doing something. And then the price, and Aaron made this point, the price of not acting becomes much, much greater than if you don't say in the first place that we're going to act. Eisenhower paid some price, the U.S. paid some price in Hungary in '56 because it was thought that Radio Free Europe, I think, had encouraged the revolution. But President Eisenhower never said, the government of Hungary, the Nagy government must be supported. He never said we will act if the Soviets intervene. And so it was a bad thing. It was a morally distasteful moment when the U.S. sat by and watched incredibly brave people be crushed by the Soviet Union. But I think that was the limit of U.S. power, or thought to be. But I'd say, so I think your account of what happened is maybe the right defense of the Obama administration, but they really shouldn't have said, and they said it more than once, that Gaddafi has to go. And once you go that far out there, I think you shouldn't say that unless you're willing to follow it up with a reasonable amount of action. Now, I don't also believe, and I'll be quiet, I've talked too long, that that if you have to, that the worst thing in the world is to act and to fail. This has also become sort of a talking point. Well, unless you're sure that you can succeed, you shouldn't intervene. I don't think that's a reasonable criterion for any human endeavor, and certainly not for any foreign policy endeavor. Of course, you should make sure you have the odds as much on your side as possible, but it doesn't really do you much good to say we weren't certain we could succeed, so we did nothing. And I think you really would do nothing anytime in those circumstances. So I think you gave a pretty good defense of the president, but I'm not really, honestly, I'm not convinced by it, at least. And I still hope he'll act, incidentally. I still think it would make a huge difference in the Middle East if he at least acted decisively, if he said, we're drawing a line here on the highway in front of Benghazi. We will take military action against Gaddafi's troops if they go across this line, against planes that across this line. We will at least preserve a rebel stronghold here where they can establish their provisional government, and then we'll figure out later down the line exactly how this works out, but at least we do not allow him to crush the entire opposition. From my point of view, that would still be a better outcome than sitting by and doing nothing. Final comments, Aaron,
You may end up
Elliott?
with, it's still conceivable to me that you may end up with something like that, because you have a guy, and I don't want to beat up on him, but I think he's tension in his own sense of his own identity between Barack Obama the transformer on one hand and Barack Obama the transactor on the other. And when you are a transformational president, as he believes he is, with direct lines to Lincoln, and there's no question that he has a direct line to Lincoln, he would not be president without Abraham Lincoln, and others have convinced him that confronting the worst recession since the Great Depression gives him a direct line to FDR, and he's conjured up in his own mind that he's got a relationship with Ronald Reagan and Jack Kennedy. No, Jack Kennedy too. But this, I'm working on this new book, Can America Have Another Great President? ? This tension between Obama as, when you're a transformative figure, you cannot help but identify yourself with transformational events. And this is precisely what he's done, except there's no transactional strategy to make the transformation work. And he's caught between these two things, and it may well be that a humanitarian crisis or the urgency of the focus may push America into finally acting.
Thank you. Elliott, last word? In general, or about Libya?
Yeah, general word, I would just say, I think, really to follow up on what Aaron said, he focused on the president and what the president thinks, and I would just come back to say, I think that's very important. While it's true that there are some facts out there that are stubborn, even those stubborn facts have to be interpreted. And I am confused for the reasons you stated about Libya, for the reasons Aaron stated about what the president thinks about our foreign policy and what he thinks about our country 2 years in, halfway through his term. And that's incredibly important. It is consequential as he decides what to do about these events in the Middle East, how much to intervene. And I think he came to office with a large number of erroneous ideas. Some of them have been abandoned, like the idea that you could close Guantanamo quickly, that you should change Bush's counterterrorism program. What isn't clear, of course, is that because he found he couldn't, or did he become persuaded that actually there was a better idea? Is there a better idea about American foreign policy than the one he came to office with? And I would say I really haven't a clue.
On that note of not having a clue, it's an appropriate note to conclude this panel. Thank you, Aaron and Elliott. Thank you all for your patience.